In the first episode of Made in Abyss, we see the beautifully chaotic line work of the Crimson Splitjaw as it attacks Nat, one of our main character Rico's friends. Rico blows her whistle to draw it over, and it starts to chase after her. That line work of the monster compared to the simple, clear lines of Rico create this rough, unfocused feel. Like we never really get the time or safety to observe this beast in enough of a way for its form to become clear. It of course catches up to her. She falls to the floor, looking away in her last moments, so she doesn't have to face that horror, so she can die not quite seeing it. But then this bright, fiery blast comes out of nowhere. The camera can't even take it. Most of the picture becomes a bright glare or semi-unreadable grain. Her life was only just saved by Reg, a robot boy who will eventually leave with her on a one-way journey down into the abyss, this strange anomaly, the center point of this world. Later, Rico returns to the orphanage she lives in. She is back to safety, and that is reflected in her retelling of this story. She describes these events for youthful vigor and surge for adventure, making it sound like it was something from The Legend of Zelda. But that doesn't ring true with what we saw. The tone is totally incomparable. She looked away in that last moment out of fear, and yet here, that part of the story is totally wiped away. One of the first things that's really apparent about Made in Abyss is just how strong its world building is. Few fictional worlds feel quite so coherent and well realised as Author does. I think it's best surmised by this image from the very beginning of the show, where a rope is thrown down onto the grass, and that causes a bunch of bugs to fly away. It's the little things, the attention to detail that really makes a world feel alive. This whole city has been built around the Abyss, this mythical place, the only undiscovered location left in the whole world. This is such a cultural focus point that the desks in the orphanage are put up on the wall. The Abyss is so influential that even menial things are structured around it. If you look at the location, it doesn't exactly look like somewhere you'd want to build a town, but the allure of the Abyss has been so strong that it's pulled people there for over 2,000 years. When we see the buildings of Orth, they look aged. Most of them even have forestation growing on them. The Abyss is what created this town. No one would have built it otherwise, and they definitely wouldn't have thrived and stayed as long as Orth has. Explorers of the Abyss are the most respected and prestigious people in Orth, and they are ranked by their whistles, red being the lowest, and what Rico and her friends at the orphanage have, and the highest being white, a legendary rank held by very few people. As soon as you have one, you become part of the story of the Abyss. Immortalized, you become myth. In episode 2, a white whistle is brought back up from the surface. It belongs to Rico's mother, Liza, but the impact of her death never really hits Rico. There is a moment of hesitation and doubt when she's given the whistle though. The weight of this reality does pull on her in a different way that we haven't seen before. Rico's teacher, who himself was taught by Liza, whilst Rico doesn't even remember her face, tells her about how Liza really was. A drunk who got into a lot of fights, and no one could really tell how honest she was being. She was messy. She was a human being like all of us. But that doesn't matter now. We see they are holding what they call a resurrection festival for Liza, where we see a puppet show about her and the Abyss, mythologizing them both, being shown to even the youngest of children. Although the person has died, her legend, the idea of her, is still alive, or maybe is even born here, resurrected. Her legend loses the burden of the messy human it is defined by, and can become something pure and idealized, something to pull more and more people down into the Abyss. Now Liza has died, Rico is allowed to see some of her documents. All this information doesn't seem to be from that recently, but only now can it be shown. Despite the cultural focus point of the Abyss, so much of the information about it is kept from people. In these documents is a note that reads, "At the Netherworld's bottom, I'll be waiting." What more of a call to adventure can Rico need? But there is more to this note than the quite well-worn narrative device that it at first represents. Later on in the series, when we meet Ozan, another white whistle, she tells Rico that the handwriting is not Liza's. She would know, having been the one who trained her. And by the end of the series, we still don't know who wrote this note, but I think it's interesting to speculate. It is possible that it could have been written by the government, the mysterious power structure that is only vaguely referred to as the powers that be. They have taken a clear interest in keeping the myth of the Abyss alive, even if it's through means of deception. Then Rico steals this note and shows it to her friends at the orphanage. Shiggy tells her that anything like this, that was sent up from the 6th layer of the Abyss, can only be trusted if it's from a white whistle, which Liza was, so fine. But the reason only they can be trusted is that anyone else down there is not considered sane enough to even perceive what is going on around them. But Riko takes this totally at face value. Her mother must have been sane enough then, and therefore she must go after her. She doesn't even consider the fact that being a white whistle is clearly no guarantee of sanity. And, the fact that she herself has to get to that point on the journey to her mother, and she obviously isn't a white whistle. Despite the fact that Riko is somewhat of a rebel at the orphanage, sneaking out, stealing documents, etc., she is totally a product of Orth. The mythology that it creates is buried deep in her veins, to the point where she takes in the culture as almost a part of herself. When she talks about places in the abyss she hasn't been to, she talks about them in a way that suggests she has, like she's experienced it firsthand. She absorbs this information and creates it as part of her own narrative, like she is a cell in the body of Orth. She describes her view about this relationship to Orth quite interestingly in episode 5. Whilst they are eating, Reg asks Riko why it doesn't weird her out that she's eating the meat of an animal that eats humans. Riko describes the process like this. The animal eats the humans, and so it becomes the nutrients in the animal for when the next human eats it, quite literally becoming that person's strength. This cycle is emblematic of how the whole of Orth works in theory. Explorers sacrificing themselves so their knowledge can feed the next generation, and so on ad infinitum. What makes the setting of Orth so interesting is not just that the world itself is detailed with a very well-defined history, but that it defines those around them. Anyone who is born there is naturally imbued with those cultural values, which can be somewhat challenging, as it makes Riko a character that is sometimes hard to relate to on a one-to-one level. The way she acts is often frustrating, but it all makes sense. Of course she acts like this, when this is what she's been taught her whole life. Riko's worldview is very narrative-centric, with acts of symbolism trumping thoughts of practicality. She is drawn into the idea of the abyss she has been told. She believes in the story, not the reality. But going down the abyss is a journey into truth, to find out who you are, to find your mother. But these stories of the abyss work as the core of Orth's culture because most people haven't been. Most people only have the ideal, very few know the reality. But Riko and Reg lose that luxury once they start their journey. All the way back in episode 2, Nat tells Reg a story. One of those chainmail kind of scary stories about children suddenly getting sick and dying on their birthdays. When I think of these types of stories, I think about the success of roller coasters or horror movies, both things which pretty much guarantee a profit no matter what. Because they are a safe way to feel danger, there's a clear pull to them, a curiosity which is hard to fight. Our bodies want a way to test themselves while staying safe, to be ready for the worst that could happen. That too is the nature of scary stories. But in episode 12, we find out the truth of the disease, which reveals to us what all these stories and myths are really for, why a town like Orth is so built around them. A foreign doctor comes to the orphanage to take care of a young boy, who as his birthday is approaching, has indeed become very sick and close to death. The teacher tells this doctor that the so-called birthday disease is in fact true, but people can't believe, or maybe can't accept it. And so it ceases to be this campfire story, instead becomes a fantasy and an abstraction, a way for us to not have to look the weight of reality in the face, to protect us from it. This applies even more so to the abyss. The idea of it keeps people sane. It's that last mystery, the place where God could still be. As both Ozan and Nanachi, two people who live in the abyss, say, people don't believe in God, they believe in the abyss. It gives them hope and comfort in this dark and empty world. When Riko and Reg eventually meet Ozan, she pushes them to their emotional limits, tormenting them. She looks down on them with the gaze of inhuman eyes. She has had to live in and face the unending pressure of the abyss, of reality, and that has deeply warped her mind. Ozan tells Riko that she was a stillborn, but she was put into this strange relic to revive her and carry her back to the surface, and that sooner or later, she is going to turn back into the meat she once was. At the core of this is the realization of death. For most people, and for most of our lives, we don't live with a direct awareness of our inevitable death. It doesn't even become concrete to many of us for a long time. But now Riko has to see. To be in the abyss is to be faced with reality, with death, at every moment. We see the fear that Ozan is trying to represent in action later in the series. Of course in the brutal climax of episode 10, where Riko is poisoned and her body is almost totally destroyed, and we see it all in horrifying and endless detail. But more subtly, we see it in episode 9. Reg is unconscious for most of this episode, and so Riko has to carry him around. She starts to hallucinate from the physical effects that ascending from the abyss has on her. This is referred to as the curse of the abyss, but Nanachi later explains the scientific details. Again, another example of the truth being coated by myth. In her hallucinations, she sees all the people she cares about telling her to turn back and return home while she still can. And eventually she gives in to the vision of her mother, and she returns to the surface. She seems overjoyed, so happy to have some stability in her life, over that never-ending dark cloud of death and suffering. The only reason she chooses to go back is Reg. It's not that she doesn't regret the decision she's made, and it's not that she doesn't want to go back home, it's just that she can't leave him behind. This subverts this traditional character arc moment, making the decision not so much one of bravery, but of pity, although she most likely would not be able to return to the surface alive in anything but a hallucination. And then, as she decides to take action, decides to face reality rather than sink into the comfort of fantasy, Reg wakes up and saves her. This moment doesn't feel right, it feels anticlimactic. Her big character moment is made meaningless. Because at the end of the day, whether Rico chooses to take action or not, it does not mean anything in this cold world of reality. Without Reg, there is no question she would have been dead long ago. The fiction cannot thrive in this world of heightened truth. The myths of their world and the narrative structure of ours are both smashed to pieces by reality. Ozen is this nihilism manifest, but it's hard to argue with her beliefs, not about this world and not about our own. If we lived facing the harsh details of reality every day, rather than abstracting it with work and media, we would all lose our minds. But Ozen hasn't lost her mind. Though this is madness, there is method to it. She pushes Rico and Reg in such a brutal and scary way to teach them what the world outside is really like, to show them the reality they have to live in. She tells herself that she does this out of a sense of duty. Whatever that means, it shows she still has to keep a value system, some kind of human structure to make sense of this empty world. Nanachi too, whose mindset is so similar to Ozen that she echoes her words. People don't believe in God, they believe in the abyss. But she has one thing keeping her together, her own structure to hold her mind in place. Miti. Miti is her friend who was deeply deformed through the so-called curse of the abyss. She lives on a constant level of pain, and in her eye, Nanachi sees her soul, trapped inside this body. But despite her best efforts, she cannot mercy kill her, so she has to stay alive. She must keep going in order to find a way to end Miti's suffering before her own does. And so when she meets Reg, she asks him to do it. His laser beam seems like the only thing that really could. It would totally annihilate Miti's burdensome body and let that mind free. Nanachi almost stops him. She almost can't let him do it, let that belief structure, that drive be destroyed. But eventually he does do it. He has to. It isn't fair to keep Miti in pain just because it soothes Nanachi. After this, she decides to join Rico and Reg on their journey down into the abyss. She doesn't have much of a choice. She's given the opportunity to latch onto another structure, another narrative in her mind that conceptually leads to a neat conclusion. These stories aren't just lies told by the government to keep their citizens under control. No, they're a necessity. Everyone needs something to believe in, whether it's God or the abyss or anything else. It's impossible to face that truth, that abyss of reality. We need a pattern to shield us from it, to illuminate the eternal darkness of the universe. Whether or not Rico's mother is at the bottom of the abyss, it doesn't really matter. She needs something to do. We can't just sit in despair and count the moments until death. We need something. Anything. Anything but that.